Welcome to Cozy Mystery Stories. Tonight's affair takes us to the frost-bound heart of Nottinghamshire, to the ancient and brooding Sherwood Hall. Here, amidst swirling snow and simmering resentments, the wealthy Blackwood family has gathered for a holiday dinner. But before the night is through, a patriarch will fall, and long-buried secrets will demand a blood-soaked reckoning. Trapped by the storm, the guests must confront a chilling truth. The killer is one of them. Chapter 1. The snow began, as it so often does in England, with a certain apologetic reluctance, a mere dusting of white upon the ancient stones of Sherwood Hall. It was a lie, of course, a feathery deception that promised a picturesque Christmas card scene. I have always found nature to be a most accomplished liar when it suits her. By dusk, the lie had given way to a furious, howling truth. A blizzard, the likes of which had not been seen in Nottinghamshire for a decade, had descended upon the estate, isolating it as completely as if it had been plucked from the earth and set down upon some desolate moon. The telephone lines, those fragile little threads connecting us to the clamour of the outside world, were the first to surrender. Inside, the inhabitants of the hall were engaged in their own quiet warfare, a conflict far older and colder than the storm raging without. They were gathered, as was tradition, for the annual Christmas Eve dinner, a tradition upheld with grim determination by the master of the house, Lord Alastair Blackwood. One must always observe the little rituals of family life, for it is in these repeated performances that the cracks in the facade are most readily seen. Ah, but my dear reader, the truth is often disguised in the ordinary. Lord Alastair sat at the head of the great oak table, a man carved from the same unforgiving granite as the northern fells. His fortune, amassed through steel and shrewd, often ruthless dealings, had bought him this ancestral pile but had not bought him peace. His face was a mask of stern control, but his eyes, small and bright like a bird's, missed nothing. They darted from one family member to another, assessing, judging, and one felt perpetually finding them wanting. To his right sat his wife, Lady Beatrice. She was his second, a woman some 20 years his junior, with the sort of fragile porcelain beauty that seems to invite protection. Yet her hands, resting on the damask tablecloth, were never still. They twisted a string of pearls at her throat, smoothed an invisible crease in the silk of her gown, betraying a nervousness that her placid smile could not quite conceal. She had the eyes of someone who had seen too much, yet revealed too little. Opposite her slumped Julian, Lord Alastair's son and heir, or rather the heir presumptive. Julian was a man perpetually shadowed by disappointment, both his own and his father's. He had his father's heavy brow but none of his iron will. His suit, though expensive, was carelessly worn, and the faint tremor in his hand as he reached for his wine glass spoke of nerves, or perhaps something more. He was a man drowning in debts and resentment, a dangerous combination. Beside him sat his sister, Elena, and her husband, Robert Vance. Elena possessed a quiet, contained bitterness. She had once been a vibrant girl, but a past romantic tragedy, orchestrated by her father, had extinguished her light, leaving behind a woman who performed the duties of a wife and daughter with the weary precision of an automaton. Her husband, Robert, was a different creature altogether. He was a man on the rise, an ambitious solicitor with a quick smile that never quite reached his watchful eyes. He was the picture of deference to his father-in-law, but one sensed a coiled spring of ambition beneath the surface. At the far end of the table, a position of both honour and isolation, sat two others. Mr. Abernathy, the family solicitor, a dry, rustling man who seemed composed entirely of parchment and legal precedents. His presence at a family dinner was unusual, and had cast a pall over the proceedings. Beside him was Clara Mayhew, Lord Alastair's ward, a distant cousin, orphaned and taken in by the Blackwoods 5 years prior. She was a pale, silent girl of 19, with large, frightened eyes and a habit of seeming to shrink into the background. She was utterly unobtrusive, a ghost at the feast, and for that very reason one's eyes were drawn to her. And then there was myself, Dr. Aris Thorne, a retired physician and an old acquaintance of Alistair S. from a time before the steel mills and the title. I had been invited, I suspect, to act as a neutral buffer, a role I have played in many a domestic drama. It affords one a unique vantage point from which to observe the curious machinery of human nature. One must always consider the little grey cells, and a family dinner provides them with a veritable feast of data. The service, orchestrated by the impeccably discreet butler, Jennings, proceeded with funereal grace. Jennings had been at Sherwood Hall since before Julian was born. He was a fixture, a part of the house itself, his face a perfect, impassive mask. He knew where all the bodies were buried, both literally and figuratively, of that I had no doubt. The tension finally snapped when Lord Alistair, waving away the offer of dessert, cleared his throat. The sound was like the sharp crack of a gavel. "I have asked Mr. Abernathy to join us this evening," he began, his voice devoid of any festive warmth, "because I have an announcement to make. I have instructed him to draw up a new will." A collective intake of breath, silent but palpable. Julian's hand froze on its way to his glass. Beatrice's pearls were in peril of being snapped. "This house, this estate, the entirety of my holdings," Alistair continued, his gaze sweeping over his children with cold satisfaction, "will not be passing to either of you." He fixed his gaze on Julian, whose face had turned a pasty white. "Your profligate habits have been a drain on my resources for too long." Then to Elena, "And your marriage has produced no heir. The Blackwood line, it seems, ends with me." "Father, you can't be serious," Julian stammered, half rising from his chair. "Sit down," Alistair commanded, and the younger man subsided as if his strings had been cut. "The estate will be placed into a charitable trust, to benefit the children of the workers who built my fortune." It was a masterstroke of cruelty, dressed up as philanthropy. The final, posthumous act of control from a man who had controlled every aspect of their lives. "And what of us?" Elena's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence. "You will receive a modest annuity, enough to live on, not enough to be idle." He then turned his gaze to the far end of the table. "A similar, though slightly more generous, provision will be made for Clara." The girl looked up, her eyes wide with what looked like genuine shock. It was the first time she had been the focus of attention all evening. "And Beatrice?" Robert Vance asked, his voice smooth and solicitous, the loyal son-in-law. Lord Alistair gave a thin smile. "Beatrice is my wife. She will be well looked after as per our prenuptial agreement." The finality in his tone was absolute. The room was thick with unspoken fury. It was into this simmering cauldron of hatred that Jennings entered, carrying a silver tray. Upon it was a single glass of port and a decanter. "Your lordship's nightly port," the butler announced, his voice the only calm sound in the room. He placed the glass before Lord Alistair, who picked it up without a word, his eyes still fixed on the stunned faces of his family. He took a slow, deliberate sip. "A bitter pill for you all to swallow, I imagine," he said, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "But swallow it you shall." He took another sip, then rose from his chair. "I shall retire to my study to review some papers with Mr. Abernathy. Do try to enjoy the rest of your evening." With that, he and the solicitor departed, leaving a tableau of seething resentment in their wake. The storm howled outside, a perfect mirror to the tempest within the walls of Sherwood Hall. Chapter 2. An hour later, the charade of civility had completely crumbled. Mr. Abernathy had emerged from the study, looking ruffled, and had beaten a hasty retreat to his room, pleading a headache. One could hardly blame him. The remaining family members were scattered about the grand drawing-room, nursing their grievances and their brandies. Julian was pacing before the great stone fireplace, his face flushed. A charitable trust, the man gone mad. He built that fortune on the backs of those workers, and now he gives it back to them. It's an insult. "It's his money, Julian," Elena said, her voice flat. She was staring into the fire, her expression unreadable. "It's our legacy," he shot back. "And what about you? Content to live on a pittance while your father's name is plastered over some wretched orphanage?" Perhaps it's no less than we deserve, she murmured, a strange, cryptic remark that silenced him for a moment. Beatrice, meanwhile, had recovered her composure. She sat elegantly on a chaise lounge, a picture of wronged grace. Alastair is a man of firm convictions, she said, choosing her words with care. He believes he is doing what is right. Right, scoffed Julian. He's punishing us, he's always enjoyed it. It was at this juncture that I decided to seek out our host. The air in the room was suffocating, thick with a malice as tangible as smoke. I found the door to the study closed. I knocked once, then twice. There was no reply. A prickle of unease, a physician's intuition perhaps, ran down my spine. I tried the handle. It was locked. Alastair, I called out. Are you in there? Silence. My unease solidified into genuine alarm. I called for Jennings, who appeared with his customary spectral swiftness. His lordship locked the door, sir, the butler stated. He often does when he does not wish to be disturbed. But he's not answering, I insisted. At that moment, Julian and Robert, drawn by my raised voice, appeared in the corridor. What's the matter? Julian asked. Your father has locked himself in and is not responding. Drunk himself into a stupor, more likely, Julian sneered, though a flicker of concern crossed his face. Together we put our shoulders to the heavy oak door. It groaned in protest but held firm. The key, I said, turning to Jennings. His lordship keeps the only key on his person, sir. The door is an old one, it can only be locked from the inside. A locked room. My dear reader, the very phrase sends a shiver of delightful anticipation down the spine, does it not? It is the classic overture to a symphony of impossibilities. Robert, ever the practical one, pointed to the row of ceremonial battle-axes that adorned the corridor wall, relics of a more straightforward time. We'll have to break it down. With a heavy groan of splintering wood, the old lock gave way. We stumbled into the room. The scene within was one of perfect, terrible stillness. The fire in the hearth had died down to glowing embers. Papers, presumably the new will, were spread neatly on the vast mahogany desk. And behind it, slumped in his high-backed leather chair, was Lord Alastair Blackwood. His head was lolled to one side, his face a ghastly, purplish hue. The glass of port sat on the desk before him, now empty. He was quite dead. I moved forward immediately, my medical training taking precedence over the shock that had frozen the others. I felt for a pulse at his neck, though I knew it was a futile gesture. His skin was already cooling. His eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the coffered ceiling. On his lips there was the faintest trace of a bitter, almond-like scent. Cyanide, or a similar fast-acting poison. He's gone, I announced, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silent room. Beatrice gave a small, theatrical cry and collapsed gracefully into Robert's arms. Julian simply stared, his face a cocktail of shock, fear, and something else, something that looked horribly like relief. Clara, who had followed us into the hall, stood in the doorway, her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wider and more terrified than ever. The storm raged on. We were trapped. 7 people in a house with a murderer. The holiday dinner had reached its final, ghastly course. My little grey cells began to stir. The locked room was the first puzzle. He had locked it himself, that much was clear. Therefore, he had not suspected anything was amiss. The poison must have been administered before he entered the study. The most likely vehicle was, of course, the port. I turned my attention to the tray, which Jennings had left on a side table after bringing it in. The decanter was still half full, the glass was empty. Nobody is to touch anything, I commanded, assuming an authority I did not feel. Jennings, was the decanter full when you brought it in? Yes, Dr. Thorne, as always. And who poured the drink? I did, sir, in the pantry, as is my custom. Did anyone else have access to the decanter or the glass between the pantry and this room? Jennings' impassive facade wavered for the first time. Miss Clara was in the pantry as I was pouring, sir. She polished his lordship's glass for me with a fresh napkin, said she had spotted a smudge. All eyes turned to the pale, trembling girl in the doorway. It was a seemingly innocent gesture, the helpful act of a dutiful ward. Or was it? Ah, but the most damning actions are often cloaked in the mundane. Chapter 3. The immediate aftermath of the discovery was a study in controlled chaos. Beatrice was escorted to her room by a surprisingly solicitous Elena. Robert and Julian, after their initial shock, began to speak in low, urgent tones, the words police and impossible featuring heavily. Mr. Abernathy, drawn by the commotion, appeared looking even more like a desiccated ghost, his eyes darting about as if calculating the legal ramifications of murder. I, however, had a different purpose. With the others occupied, I turned my attention to the scene of the crime. The first task of any investigation is to question the assumptions. Everyone assumed the poison was in the port from the decanter. But what if it was not? Jennings, I said, drawing the butler aside, you and I will conduct a small experiment. You will pour a small amount of port from that decanter into a fresh glass for myself, and for every other person in this house. We will see if anyone else suffers an ill effect. It was a risk, I admit, but a calculated one. A murderer clever enough to use a fast-acting poison in a locked room would surely not be so foolish as to poison the entire supply. Jennings, his face grim but his hands steady, did as I asked. We gathered the remaining household members. A trembling Clara, a defiant Julian, a watchful Robert, a bewildered Abernathy, and a stoic Elena, in the drawing room. One by one, under my supervision, they each took a small, hesitant sip from their glass. Beatrice, it was decided, was too overwrought to participate. Nothing happened. The port in the decanter was harmless. This was a fact of supreme importance. It narrowed the possibilities immensely. The poison had been introduced to Lord Alastair and Lord Alastair alone. The method was targeted, precise. It was not a wild act of passion. It was a calculated execution. My mind returned to Clara's action in the pantry, polishing the glass. A cloth, a napkin, it would be the perfect way to introduce a substance to the rim, where it would be ingested with the first sip. I took the girl aside. She was huddled in a large armchair, looking small and lost. Clara, my dear, I began, my voice as gentle as I could make it. Tell me again about the pantry. You wiped the glass for Jennings. Yes, Dr. Thorne, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I saw a little smudge, a fingerprint, I think. I just wanted everything to be perfect for Uncle Alastair. I see. And the napkin you used, where is it now? Her eyes widened. The napkin, I believe Jennings took it with the rest of the used linen from dinner. A dead end, or was it? If a substance had been wiped onto the glass, it had to have come from somewhere. It must have been on her person. My investigation was interrupted by Julian. Thorne, this is ridiculous. Playing detective while my father lies dead. We need to do something. And what do you suggest we do, Julian? I asked coolly. The snow is 3 feet deep and rising. The telephone is dead. We are quite on our own until the weather breaks. In the meantime, a murderer is among us. I suggest that finding out who that is should be our primary occupation. My words had the desired sobering effect. The reality of their situation began to dawn on them. They were not merely a bereaved family. They were a pool of suspects, trapped with a killer and a victim. I decided to interview each of them in turn, using the library as my makeshift office. It is remarkable what people will reveal under pressure, what little slips of the tongue and furtive glances can betray. Julian was first. He was belligerent, defensive. He made no secret of his hatred for his father. Yes, I'm glad he's dead, he blustered. The old tyrant deserved it, but I didn't kill him. I may be a drunk and a disappointment, but I'm not a murderer. His alibi was that he had been in the billiard room, alone, drinking. It was, I noted, an alibi entirely without corroboration. Elena was next. She was a far more difficult proposition. Her composure was absolute, her grief, if it existed, locked away behind a mask of cold indifference. My father made his own bed, she said, her voice chillingly calm. He destroyed my life once. I will not pretend to mourn his death. She claimed to have been in her room, reading. Like her brother, she had no one to vouch for her. As she spoke, she fiddled with the clasp of her handbag. I saw a piece of paper, folded small, fall to the floor. Before I could comment, she had snatched it up and thrust it back into the bag, her cheeks flushing for the first time. A secret then. Robert, her husband, was smooth and articulate. He expressed all the appropriate sentiments of shock and sorrow. He spoke of his respect for Lord Alastair, of his plans to help Julian manage the estate. It was all a little too polished. He had been with Elena, he claimed, for a short while before coming down to the drawing room. A partial alibi, and a weak one at that. Beatrice, having made a miraculous recovery, was next. She was the grieving widow personified, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "He was a difficult man, Doctor," she sighed, "but he was my husband. I can't believe anyone would do this." Her performance was flawless, yet I recalled something. Earlier in the week, when I had arrived, I had passed the library and seen her engrossed in a book. I had noted the title idly at the time. It was a treatise on medicinal herbs and their properties. When I questioned her about it, she paled. "Oh, just a passing interest in gardening, Doctor, a little hobby." A hobby indeed. Finally, there was Mr. Abernathy. The solicitor was terrified. "This is a nightmare," he stammered, constantly wiping his sweaty palms on his trousers. "Lord Alastair was agitated after your dinner. He wanted to add a codicil to the new will, something about an old debt he felt he had to repay." A debt to whom? He wouldn't say, he just kept muttering a name, Middleton. He said he had wronged a man named Middleton years ago, his first business partner. Before I could press him for details, he slumped over. I thought he'd had a stroke. Middleton, the name meant nothing to me. But it was a new thread, a loose end dangling from the past. A man who builds an empire like Alastair's does not do so without making enemies. Hours passed. The night deepened, the silence in the house broken only by the relentless assault of the wind. I sat in the dead man's study, the scene of the crime, piecing together the fragments. Every single person had a motive: Julian for his inheritance, Elena for revenge, Robert for control, Beatrice for her freedom. Even Abernathy might have had a reason, should the will have contained something he wished to suppress. And Clara, the quiet girl who polished the glass, what was her story? I began a methodical search of the room. A man like Alastair Blackwood was bound to have secrets, and a study is often their mausoleum. My attention was drawn to the fireplace. Amidst the ashes of the burnt-out fire, I saw a glint of metal. Using a pair of tongs, I carefully extracted it. It was the corner of a tin plate photograph, warped and blackened by the heat. Most of the image was gone, but one could just make out two figures. A younger Alastair standing beside another man. The other man's face was almost completely obscured by the burn marks, but there was a name and a date on the back, faint but legible. A. Blackwood and T. Middleton, Sheffield, 1948. Middleton, the name from the past. My search continued. In a locked drawer of the desk, the key for which I found after some searching on the victim's key ring, I found a bundle of old letters and a small, leather-bound diary. The diary was Alastair's, dating back 30 years. The letters were from a woman. I scanned them quickly. They were desperate, pleading letters, concerning the fate of her husband, Thomas Middleton, who had apparently been ruined in a business deal with Alastair and had subsequently taken his own life. The final letter was from the woman's sister, informing Alastair of her death from grief and illness, and begging him to make some provision for the couple's only child, a little girl. A little girl left orphaned. My blood ran cold. I looked at the signature on the last letter. The sister's surname was Mayhew. The puzzle pieces were snapping into place with a dreadful, sickening certainty. Clara Mayhew was not some distant cousin. She was Clara Middleton, the daughter of the man Alastair Blackwood had destroyed. He had taken her in not out of charity, but out of a twisted, secretive guilt. He had raised the daughter of his own victim under his roof. And she, it seemed, had finally discovered the truth. My mind flew to the conservatory, where I had seen her earlier in the day, tending to the potted plants. I remembered one in particular, a tall, elegant plant with bell-shaped purple flowers. a beautiful, innocent-looking thing. Foxglove, the source of digitalis, a potent cardiac poison. Odorless, tasteless, and in a concentrated form, utterly deadly. Chapter 4. The house slept, but it was a restless, shallow sleep, the kind that is haunted by suspicion. I, however, could not rest. The little grey cells were working furiously, arranging and rearranging the facts until they formed a coherent, if monstrous, picture. The motive was clear, the means was almost certain, but I needed the final, irrefutable proof. I made my way quietly to Clara's room. It was a small, sparsely furnished chamber in a disused wing of the hall, a room for a poor relation, not a cherished ward. The door was unlocked. I slipped inside, using the light from a small pocket torch. The room was neat, almost unnaturally so. On her bedside table was a book. It was not a novel or a book of poetry, as one might expect of a young lady. It was a detailed academic text, an introduction to pharmacognosy, the study of medicines derived from natural sources. A bookmark, a simple ribbon, marked a chapter on cardiac glycosides. In the bottom drawer of her wardrobe, beneath a pile of neatly folded woolens, I found a small wooden box. It contained not jewellery or girlish keepsakes, but the tools of a chemist. A pestle and mortar, several small glass vials, one of which was empty, and a hypodermic syringe. There were also dried leaves, which I recognized instantly as those of the foxglove plant. She had not merely been tending the plants, she had been harvesting them. She had created her own poison, here in this small, forgotten room. The final piece was the method of delivery. The napkin. It was a long shot, but I made my way down to the servants' quarters, to the laundry room. There, in a large wicker basket, was the soiled linen from the evening's dinner. I spent a full half-hour sorting through the damask napkins, my heart pounding with a mixture of dread and intellectual excitement. And then I found it. One napkin, identical to the others, but for a very faint, almost invisible brownish-green stain near one corner. The residue of the concentrated digitalis she had wiped onto the rim of Alastair's glass. I had it all. The motive, the means, the opportunity. A chain of evidence, solid and complete. The following morning the snow had stopped. A cold, white world lay silent outside. The atmosphere within the house, however, was about to break. I requested that everyone assemble in the drawing room after breakfast. I stood before them by the fireplace much as a barrister might address a jury. They watched me, their faces a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and anticipation. Julian, haggard and pale, Elena and Robert, a united defensive front, Beatrice, anxious and uncertain, and Clara sitting slightly apart as always, her hands folded in her lap, her expression placid. She was a remarkable actress. Last night, I began, my voice resonating in the quiet room, Lord Alastair Blackwood was murdered. He was poisoned by a dose of concentrated digitalis, administered in his glass of port. I paused, letting the words sink in. The poison was not in the decanter. It was applied directly to the rim of his personal glass. The murderer needed access to that glass shortly before it was served. Only one person fits that description. I saw Julian's eyes flicker towards the butler, Jennings, who stood impassively by the door. A common mistake to suspect the servants, but this was not a crime of servitude. The action was disguised as one of helpfulness, I continued, my gaze now fixed on the still figure in the armchair. An offer to polish a smudge from the glass, an act so trivial, so unremarkable that it was barely noticed. I saw a flicker in Clara's calm facade, a slight tightening of her hands, but the motive for this crime was not born of last night's argument over a will. It was born 30 years ago in the steel foundries of Sheffield. It was born of greed and betrayal. I proceeded to lay out the story of Thomas Middleton, of his ruin and suicide, of his wife's death, and of the orphaned daughter left behind. I spoke of the letters, the diary, the burnt photograph. Lord Alastair lived with his guilt, I said. He brought that child here, giving her a new name, raising her under his roof. But he did not give her the truth, a fatal error, for the truth, as it always does, came out. I turned fully to Clara. You found the letters, didn't you, Clara? Or should I say, Clara Middleton? You learned that the man you called Uncle was the architect of your family's destruction. And you planned your revenge with a patience and a scientific precision that is truly chilling. The room was utterly silent. Everyone stared at the slight, pale girl as if seeing her for the first time. She looked up at me and the mask of the timid ward fell away. Her eyes, no longer frightened, were chips of ice. There was no denial. He took everything from them, she said, her voice low but clear and steady. My father, my mother. My life, he paid for this house with their blood. The will that was the final insult. To offer me a pittance, his charity after what he had done, it was not justice. It was a continuation of his power over me. So you killed him, I stated. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. I administered the justice he had denied my parents for 30 years. I studied my father's books on botany. I learned what the plants in the conservatory could do. I waited for the perfect moment. The announcement about the will provided it. Everyone had a reason to want him dead. I knew you would all suspect each other. It was a confession delivered with a cold, unnerving pride. Julian looked aghast. Beatrice seemed to shrink back into her chair. This was not a crime of passion they could understand. It was something else entirely, a spectre from a past they knew nothing about. The broken vial by the fire in his study, I murmured, thinking aloud. That was a misdirection, wasn't it? To make us think the poison was administered in the room. A small piece of theatre, she confirmed, a faint, ironic smile touching her lips. He deserved a dramatic exit. The great puzzle was solved. The murderer was unmasked. There was no triumph in it, only a profound sense of tragedy. A cycle of crime and revenge, spinning down through the decades, had culminated in this cold, quiet room. As if on cue, a faint noise was heard from outside. The sound of a powerful engine grinding its way up the snow-filled drive. The snowplow. The outside world was breaking through. Rescue and the police were on their way. The isolation of Sherwood Hall was over, but the shadows of that night would linger forever. Clara Middleton, the quiet, vengeful ghost at the feast, sat perfectly still. A small, solitary figure awaiting the arrival of a justice far less absolute than the one she had delivered herself. The family, the Blackwoods, were left only with the ruins of their legacy and the bitter knowledge of the secrets upon which it was built.